organization of this wonderful event. I've been on sabbatical, but I'm happy that at least we could provide the space here. And it's really a great honor, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome you this morning. I'm going to speak later on, but at this point I would like to ask Molly Andrews from University of East London to say a few words. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm just really going to talk very, very briefly, but just to say a few personal words about what it's like to work with Nira and to teach with Nira. And I could just say one word, which would be delight, but I'm going to embellish it a little bit. And to say that I knew of Nira's work long before I ever got to meet her. And when she was coming to UEL, there was a great buzz around the place. We just couldn't believe that she was coming. It was like, oh my God. And I mean, that her work is wonderful and important. We all know, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today. But actually, to meet Nira the person was just an extraordinary and is an extraordinary experience. And I would say just three things. One is that she is the kind of colleague that that you dream of having, and in these hard times we know what it means to stick your head above the parapet, and Nira's always willing to do that, and it really means a lot. The other thing is to say that Nira has always been a great friend of our Center for Narrative Research, which is now in its 11th year, but back in the earlier days when it was a lot more vulnerable, maybe it's vulnerable again, Nira was always there for us and with us. And then laterally she has, as you know, begun her own research center, CMRB, which again we'll hear from today, but there's so much synergy between these two research centers that it's really something that we feel extremely fortunate to have. The final thing that I want to say is that Nira and I have co-supervised a number of PhD students, two of whom, well, Masi, you've heard a lot from, because Masi was so wonderful in the organization of this and really just putting unbelievable amounts of hours into it, and also Chigdem Essen, and then today, not that Chigdem wasn't Nira's student, but she is a PhD student who, she was a PhD student who was very much around when Nira was so much part of our environment, but also Nicola Sampson. And what it means to actually co-supervise with Nira is very, very moving, okay, because you actually get to see her in work, as she really, as she nourishes and also very, very rigorously challenges these wonderful younger scholars coming up. And I guess for me, the final thing is just to say that for me, Nira really is someone who puts real feminism and feminist scholarship into practice, and that means a lot to me to be able to work with her. The very last thing I'd say is, I'm sorry, I only had this idea like literally about 24 hours ago. We bought a little book, this nice little pink thing here. And it's already, some of you were already quick on the march, and it's got some pictures and all that. But even if, so I apologize for not having had the idea earlier and given you a little more notice about it. Some of you have brought stuff. Even if you haven't brought anything, if you feel like writing in it or you feel like actually sending something later, we can add it to it. But we thought that since the day is such a special day, it might be something nice to send Nira home with something as well. So welcome and thank you very much. And now I'll hand over to Corinne.
Thank you, Molly. I'm Corinne Squire, also from the Centre for Narrative Research at the University of East London, and there's little to add really to what Molly said, I think, except that Molly has worked quite intimately with Nira, teaching and so on, and I just would like to say how inspiring her presence has been for those of us who haven't actually got research interests strongly in common and yet have been able to draw so much from her presence at the University of East London. And of course that applies to people outside as well. I'm sure you know that way before I met Nira, I remember reading things of hers about completely other work than I was doing that made so much sense and made so much difference to what I was doing. So I hope that, I mean, this day is probably for many people who've worked for Nira with Nira for a long time and know her well, but also hopefully for people whose engagements have been different, but no less intense sometimes. So it's really great to have this day. I'd like to thank, as Molly said, our team of colleagues who are, some of them still outside registering people and so on, Mazzy and Chidam Essen and Mary Sutton and Nicola Sampson. They're all working outside, so that's great. Just on kind of housekeeping things, someplace out to the left there are bathrooms, and if you go up to the reception, on the left-hand side, there's a staircase down to the student shop, which is where you can cash in your drinks vouchers at the break. And then at lunchtime, there's going to be a lunch provided just outside here for you. And I think you also have a little lunch voucher for that. So, okay, I think that's the minimal housekeeping we need, really. And we can move on to the first of the sessions, which Molly's actually going to chair. So, thank you.
Just two things I forgot to say. One is, I did forget to mention terribly Corin Squire, who actually has done so very much in making this day hopefully what it will be. So thank you, Corin. I feel badly for not having said that. And secondly, those of you who are speaking, and there are a lot of people who are speaking, will have noticed this very funny little thing where we say 15 minutes after your name. And what that means is, what we're trying to do today is really get a wide feel for the various ways in which Nira's work has intersected with people's lives and their scholarship. And when we sat down with Nira at the first planning committee and said, well, should we just have like 2 or 3 speakers and they could speak more substantially, or quite a few, we decided on the second, because why not have, you know. So what that means is we'll just ask you to keep your contributions to 15 minutes. When I'm chairing, I'm rather rigorous about that. And then we'll have time for the discussion at the end. And since everybody has biographical notes, we save time, so we don't actually do extensive introductions, except for to say our first speaker is Floya Anthias, and I will give over to you, Floya.
Okay, well, where shall I begin? It's a great thrill for me to be here today celebrating Nira's work, and I can only echo what already has been said from her colleagues at East London. Having been a colleague of Nira's at the University of Greenwich, what seems to be centuries ago now, but for many, many years, probably over 20, 25 years, I can echo that. And it was, for me, a great moment when Nira arrived in the department at Greenwich, because we were a very small department at the time, in the 1970s. And Nira came as a great breath of air with political passions and a vigour, which I felt so close to, and we shared so many understandings of the world and so many hopes about the world. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we evolved the work we did together to begin with, just to give you a flavour of some of the things that prompted this work. Because it was a very fruitful collaboration, particularly fruitful for me. I had just had 2 small children, and I was beginning to develop my academic career. And finding Nira in the department, we shared so many interests, and one of the things that we were particularly interested in, of course, was the way feminism related to other struggles. And I should say that from the outset, Nira's work wasn't just theoretically informed and sociologically informed, but always politically informed. And I would say that the political analysis that she brought to our common work was absolutely fundamental to where the work went. Issues of inequality, of social justice, of social divisions, nationalism, ethnicity, racism, and feminism. I myself come from a background very much grounded in political activism through my family of origin, and a country, Cyprus, where ethnic and national conflict, as well as colonialism and post-colonialism, have left an indelible mark. Meeting Nira and our collaboration, as I said, was enormously significant in bringing those insights that I already had from that background forward. And one of the earliest things that I remember very much in terms of our collaboration, and maybe I hope Nira doesn't mind me mentioning it, was our experience at the sex and class group of the CSE, where we were both involved, the Conference of Socialist Economists, for those who don't know, who were Capital and Class was one of the publications that came out of the Conference of Socialist Economists. And there was a sex and class group where Marxist and socialist feminists met regularly and discussed issues. And Nira and I were both beginning to talk about how feminism related to anti-racist struggles and also to ethnic and nationalist struggles. And we were very keen to kind of put this forward. And one of the things that I think we both remember is that apart from one or two people, there was actually very little response to this interest. And this is what drove us in the early 1980s to put together an article where we tried to look at how gender, ethnicity, race related to feminist struggles. And this was called Contextualizing Feminism, which appeared finally in Feminist Review in 1983. And in this, we looked at Marxism and the role of Marxism and Marxist feminism, and we wanted to broaden the agenda very much and to dispel the notion of a unitary sisterhood without reference to, which didn't refer to differences across racial and ethnic lines in terms of experiences and in terms of social practices and locations. So to some extent, that, I think, was, a very important moment for us because, we realized that in Britain at least, although some work was being done in America at the time of bringing together feminism and anti-racism, particularly through the black women's struggle, and important articles were being written in America, and books, Bell Hooks in 1981, and political activism, very much conscious of the interface between feminism and anti-racism. In Britain, I think I'm right to say, there was very little that was happening, and we wanted to introduce this onto the feminist agenda. And I think that was a very important moment because it also showed that we both, in different ways, were coming from a kind of, not only from a socialist, but a kind of Marxist-inspired analysis, but at the same time felt uncomfortable with some of the presuppositions of traditional Marxism about the centrality only of the economy, and also the masculinist sort of elements within Marxist analysis. And we wanted to move away from that and broaden it, but retain the political dynamic of a Marxist-inspired analysis and a feminist-inspired analysis. And working with Nira on that first article we did together is very indicative of the kind of collaborative work that Nira is so good at, because I can say that, we kind of sparked ideas from each other in a very fruitful way. That's the way I see it anyway. And I think what we decided at the time then is to continue in this theme by looking at a concrete case, doing research on gender, ethnicity, and particularly in relation to South East London, where we were based. And from this came our well, I should say before that, actually, because I can't read my notes, I haven't got my glasses on, I have to go like this, but I've forgotten that before that stage, there was a very important stage relating to gender and nation, which this theme this morning is about, which is that Nira had already been writing on issues of gender and nation, and she organised a very interesting and empowering conference on our Dartford site, where many scholars who were writing on women and biological reproduction, women and the state, Francesca Clark, the names, I've got them written here, but anyway, I'll tell you a little bit later. But she organised this conference, and it was so successful and so innovative that Nira decided that she wanted to make a book and kindly invited me to take part in editing the book. This was really, I would say, Woman, Nation, State was essentially Nira's baby. And I came in as a co-editor, and of course, once there, I was involved in we wrote the introduction together. And this introduction, interestingly enough, we tried we sent it to a journal before we put it in the book, or a version to the journal. And, well, to our surprise, it was rejected. And the argument was it was too general, it wasn't insightful, I don't remember exactly, and it was very disappointing. But we struggled ahead, as younger scholars must do, to the book, and we put the book together. And this book, Woman, Nation, State, I think, even though I was a co-editor on it, I would say has become quite a pivotal book in the whole area of the relationship between gender and nation. Of course, the book wasn't about gender and nation. It was about women's role in national and ethnic processes. And it was Nira who later on, I think it was 1996, produced a marvellous and very influential book which actually addresses the issue of gender and nation, which moves forward from woman, nation, state, develops the analysis further, and actually incorporates properly the issue of gender rather than just the issue of women. So that, again, that collaboration, and one of the significant things that I remember about that was a couple of very nice sunny afternoons in Cyprus when I was spending the year in Cyprus just before the book came out, and Nira visited, and we had, I think, a very lovely time in the garden with the sun, talking about our introduction. Of course, Alain was there, and it was an opportunity for Nira and Alan to get together in Cyprus, but it's up to her if she wants to tell you about that. And, of course, Gull came, and we had a wonderful holiday as well, going to the beach and so on. So it was the best sort of collaboration on academic things, which combined having fun as well as writing and so on. And after Woman, Nation, State, as I said before, I put it a little bit out of order, we moved to producing what eventually became Racialized Boundaries. And in Racialized Boundaries, which was a kind of outcome of our discussions relating to research that we were doing in Southeast London, particularly looking at sort of the GLC and initiatives around multiculturalism and anti-racism, the response of people in the borough to that, with a number of research assistants, the most important of which proved to be our last one, Harriet Kane, who is an associate author on this. In this book, we, I think, addressed the issue of racialization and the parameters of racialization. And we were very keen in this book to look at racialization and racism as very much linked to phenomena which we might call the phenomena of ethnos, or the phenomena of the nation, of ethnicity. Indeed, earlier on, after contextualizing feminism, when we'd already begun to think of racism as one of a number of different discourses and practices which related to collectivities, to ethnic and national phenomena, we had been accused by Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh of dissipating the importance of racism, and I think they missed very much the point that we weren't dissipating it. And in Racialized Boundaries, where we took the issue up again, we did not argue that racism was the same as ethnocentrism, or that race, discourse and practice was the same as ethnicity and nationalism. In fact, we made it clear that there are distinct discourses and practices, and they're located within specific circumstances and contexts, and that issues of exclusion and otherness relate to all these phenomena, to ethnicity, to nation, to race, and the importance was tackling these and looking at them specifically as they manifested themselves at different times. And in this book, we also address again the issue of gender. So, of course, Nira has moved forward from this work that we did in the 1980s and 1990s. I mentioned her book on gender and nation. She's written on a large number of central issues in modern society. So a very important social and political commentator, as well as academic. So issues of fundamentalism, issues of settler societies, issues of secularism and religion, and of course belonging and identity that her latest book is concerned with, have all had a very central place in her work. And intersectionality, which I'm not going to say very much about because I know this is the theme later on. All I can say is that when we started the work together in contextualizing feminism, and indeed in earlier work of both Nira and I, we had what became later called an intersectional lens. We did not think of issues of class as something that can be easily separated in practice from issues of sex, of gender inequalities and ethnic inequalities, and vice versa with all of them. But on the other hand, we both wanted to maintain the importance of looking at these analytically separately before looking at how they related to one another in the real world. So whilst we were intersectional, the form of intersectionality, I believe, that we both continue developing is one that holds on to the importance of the specificities of the different dimensions of inequality around ethnicity, class and gender, and also how they interrelate and interlock in different conditions at different times. So, final word, Nira, thank you very much, and thank you for being a friend, and probably the best friend one could have. Nira, I can say, is always someone who is there for you, and she's wonderful to her students and wonderful to her colleagues. So thank you for this opportunity.
That was amazing. Thank you. Well, I also went to Cyprus with Nira. And it was for conference bringing together activists and academics, as Nira tends to do so often. But what I remember particularly about this trip was that Nira was a great ally. I mean, I was looking for someone to go to the beach with, and it was quite complicated to get there. And so I really appreciated that Nira was, part of the project. And I think that for me it's quite sort of symbolic. Yes, we spent 3 days, in a very intense debate about, human rights model with respect to women's rights and whether it was useful or not. But, you know, we could have easily just collapsed and sat somewhere in a hotel. But Nira has this incredible life-affirming energy and also ability to have fun, which is great. I should say the first time I met Nira, which was actually through my friend Cynthia Coburn. I was the luckiest lodger in the world. When I was a PhD student, I ended up in Cynthia's house, and I met all these amazing women, including Nira. I have to say, I think with a little sense of embarrassment about our first encounter, because I think I started to argue with you. I don't remember the content, but I remember it was quite self-righteous, and I feel a bit embarrassed. It was in the context of Women Against Fundamentalism, my first meeting. And sort of the last personal anecdote, and what is really sort of sticking out, is when many years later, I was, at the same time, Nira and I were in Bochum visiting professors, and I have to say this was, for me, one of the most difficult parts of my working life. I had a baby at the time, and my partner couldn't be there, so I was there on my own with not much childcare. And if it wasn't for Nira, who had been so supportive and gave me some, you know, really, just, you know, her presence made a huge difference at the time. Now, in terms of my work, I was asked to speak about the question in how Nira's and also, of course, beginning Floya's work on gender and nationalism has influenced my own work. And I should say it had a profound impact on it. I mean, I'm not going to go into any details about the content of either Woman, Nation and State, and also later Gender and Nationalism, Gender Nation. But I should say that for me, the stunning, one of the stunning aspects is that, you know, the whole question of the various ways in which the nation is gendered, and how nation and gender are constructive of each other. I mean, in many circles, certainly I would argue in our circles and women and gender studies globally, I mean, Floya was very humble, but these, you know, have been key texts, and I don't know of any syllabus in which you don't have, you know, women, nation, state, or at least some chapters. I mean, there have been such pivotal works. But at the same time, I still find it stunning that sometimes I still go to some conferences and some panels, and there's some men talking about nationalism, some women as well, you know, who still seem to be able to talk about it without actually having a gendered lens. I think that is really shocking, because all of us who are familiar with the work, I mean, it's so obvious that you cannot but look at you know, nationalism, construction of the nation through a gendered lens. And certainly in the context of my work, which has been very much you know, built on Nira's work, whether it's with respect to Egypt. I worked on the women's movement in Egypt and secularism in Egypt, and later on Bosnian refugees, but certainly also very much now in the context of Iraq. It's so key. So one strand particularly, of course, that I've been very interested in, that has been evolving over the years, relates to the role of nationalism in the context of feminist activism. The question of whether nationalism and feminism are compatible or mutually exclusive. And this, of course, has been a source of contestation amongst feminists. And I think that is also very key to Nira's work. Now, many feminists, particularly in Europe and North America, view nationalism generally as antithetical to feminist aims and struggles. And I have to say, this is also how I have started out looking at the relationship between nationalism and feminism. But over the last years, particularly with respect to work of friends who've looked at Palestine more closely, and myself who looked at Iraq and also Iraqi Kurdistan, I think that it's very important to look at this picture in a more complex way, that there is a diversity of experiences concerning the relationship between feminism and nationalism, certainly in the Middle East. For instance, Palestinian men and women view anti-nationalist feminist politics and at attitudes as antithetical to their struggle for Palestinian rights. And you know, some scholars I have, there's Frances Hasso and Sophie Richter-Devro, in Palestine have demonstrated that nationalism can facilitate women's agency and empowerment in a context where grassroots mobilization rather than military struggle is the key movement strategy and the movement's ideology. I mean, I'm still personally very much dubious about the emancipatory potential of nationalism, but just let me briefly tell you a little bit of how it has played out in the context of my work on Iraq, where, you know, at some point in the past, the regime of Saddam Hussein did use modernist, nationalist slogans to push women into the labor force, to push women into the education sector. I mean, the very classic idea of the kind of modernist patriarch, and, you know, not engaging in the promotion of women's rights for feminist or egalitarian principles, but, you know, as part of modernizing the nation. What we see now happening in Iraq, not only going back to women, nation, and state, the construction of communities along ethnic, national lines, very much gendered. I mean, we had literally, we have not only symbolically, but literally physically, over the bodies of women, you have communities being constructed. I mean, in 2007, in Basra alone, over 200 women were killed for not being Islamic enough, and this was in the context of different Islamist groups fighting over territory, fighting over resources, and literally using women's bodies to demarcate boundaries, to demarcate differences. And we find this very much also now amongst Sunni and Shia Iraqis, and also again, amongst Arabs and Kurds. So this is very much there, very clearly. But at the same time, my most recent work, and again, you know, I'm very much looking to Nira and her reflections on these issues. My most recent work with my colleague Nicola Pratt looked at the Kurdish women's movement and Kurdish feminism in Iraq and its relationship to nationalism. And here again, I guess what one of our findings really is that, you know, we cannot make general statements about the relationship between feminism and nationalism without really looking at the specific empirical context and what kind of nationalism and what kind of feminism. I mean, in the Kurdish context, what we see emerging now is really kind of neoliberal feminism that is very closely affiliated with the occupation in Iraq, and it's very supportive, actually, of US support, US aid. You know, and at the same time, you have a situation where the Kurdish government is at least paying lip service to women's rights, very different to the central Iraqi government. I was just telling a colleague a few weeks ago, the Minister of Women's Affairs in Iraq, the newly elected or appointed Minister of Women's Affairs, I should say, came out and in an interview was arguing how much violence against women was permissible. This is the Minister of Women's Affairs. So in that context, actually Iraqi women's rights activists are looking to their Kurdish counterparts for support. So, I mean, I don't have time to go into great details here, but just to say that what I found in the context of different Iraqi nationalisms over time and also different Kurdish nationalisms. I mean, in Iraqi Kurdistan, you have a situation from an independent struggle now to a situation where there is a independent, not an independent, but a semi-autonomous Kurdish regional government, so very different, a shift. And the kind of feminisms linked to that also have shifted, you know, from a kind of feminism very closely related to anti-colonial independence struggle to a feminism that is very much linked to neoliberalism and also to, I would say, US empire building. Not all, but generally speaking. Anyway, what for me is very interesting when I see, you know, people referring to Nira's work. It sometimes makes me think about the way Orientalism was used, because I think
both Nira and Floya have evolved the ideas and the concepts so much, but there's still lots of people who sort of seem to be referring, you know, back to some of the original ideas, which are still very valid, but of course you've complicated the picture so much, and it makes me think about also Orientalism, the way it's used, and, you know, in a very similar term. And that's one of the, for me, really amazing things about Nira. She's always a step ahead of herself. So, you know, like, in terms of her complicating the picture, and also not, you know, some people sort of get so close to a concept and then, you know, defend it at all costs, but Nira actually is able to also to let go and said, yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking, but now I've actually thought about it more, and I want to complicate the picture, and maybe this is not really the best way to think about it anymore. I'm now particularly thinking about transversal politics, for example, but many other issues where you know, it's not that you moved from one thing to the next, but actually evolved. And I think that's amazing, and that's what good scholarship should be about. But I think it's particularly the case because of the fact that you're linking it so much to activism. And I think the moment we do it, the moment we are linked to real struggles, then things become quite messy and complex and fluid. And I would also like to thank you for having inspired me over the years, and also for your friendship. Thank you, Nira.
Well, thank you to our two speakers. What a wonderful, wonderful start. We are actually at the time when we're supposed to go have coffee, but I think that let's take a moment, and if there are any questions or comments for either for our two speakers, or more generally that you'd like to start the day off with. Please.
I'm wondering if either both of you or yourself perhaps would like to add anything in terms of the third term in the topic for this session of reproduction and the reproductive, and what? Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me without this? Doesn't seem to make any difference. I was just wondering if you'd like to speak to the third term in the topic about reproduction and the reproductive and the entanglement of gender and nation in relationship to that, and maybe following on from what Nadje just said, reflecting on how the entanglement of the reproductive has perhaps moved on or is complicated since Nira and Floya so importantly made that link for us in Woman Nation State, that women's reproductive role is bound up with these questions, and that was really an important way into thinking about the entanglements of gender, nation, and ethnicity. So just the reproductive.
I'll say something, and Nira, I'm sure will want to also say something. I mean, the term reproduction functions in different ways, and it has, you know, very different meanings depending on what the focus is. And here, it's a very broad category. And one of the things that in Woman Nation State we wanted to say was it wasn't just about national reproduction, the reproduction of the nation, but also transformation of the nation, that you can't talk about reproduction. That's a very functionalist position to say that the nation is reproduced. Of course, certain aspects of the nation are reproduced because of power relations within the nation, because of the workings of power. And here, you know, women, for example, which was the focus of Woman Nation State particularly, have a role as biological reproducers. We argued there were 5 ways in which women contribute to the nation. One is biological reproducers of the nation, because they actually physically reproduce the nation, but also they were given a symbolic role as reproducers of the nation, reproducers of the soldiers, of the patriarchs, of the national subjects, and only certain categories of women were actually allowed within the nation state to have this reproductive role. So it wasn't just reproduction per se, but specific categories of women who were defined by their ethnic or by boundaries of various types were given the role of reproducing the nation. But of course, as well as the biological, there was cultural reproduction, women's central role in the sort of preservation of culture, the transmission of culture as mothers, as important in, for example, in keeping the family network together. In migration, certainly women play a very key role in sort of maintaining links with family abroad and other contexts abroad. So reproduction work there, it was not just about sort of biological reproduction, but also women's role as mothers was also a symbolic thing that happened in some nations. The nation was represented, we argued, and Cyprus is particularly case in point, in the 1974 war, where the symbol of the martyred Cyprus was a woman grieving for her soldier son, or lost son. So that there are different ways in which motherhood and familialism interpenetrate with the power dimensions of the nation. But women are very often both agents and subjects of this process. And I think perhaps one of the criticisms we could both make of this, I don't know, this early work, that we treated the women very much as being worked upon by the nation. And certainly one of the things that I think we're both now much more keen to stress is women's agency and how women participate in this very process, as well as challenging it, that it's not a monolithic process of reproduction. Some of the things that women might do in feminist neoliberalism, for example, might be to reproduce, but at the same time, in other ways, they undermine and challenge. Yeah. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to say on it, except that I'm working in a context where I'm often confronted with exceptionalism linked to the Middle East, and I think Nira's and Floya's work helped me to break that, to show that some of the, these processes that you outlined are not just linked to the Middle East, but happened in other contexts. I think that's so important for me, because that's right now in the post-September 11th world, there is always this sort of tendency to create this exceptionalism, especially when it comes to gender. And I very much benefit from being able to use some more cross-cultural comparisons to break that. But yeah, I mean, that there are changes in terms of, I think you're probably thinking also about new technologies and immigration and migration. But maybe Nira wants to comment on this.
Maybe, sorry, very shortly, in this new book about the politics of belonging, one of the things I mention in relation to citizenship is intimate citizenship, which is very much the way that women's and men's bodies, both surveillance, but also this is in relation to new constructions of citizenships under globalization and the new technologies. And what we've heard this week, for example, that suddenly cesareans are going to be part of the basket of how women are going to define how they want to be mothers, is part of these constructions of the citizen as consumer, that instead of kind of, it's part of depoliticization of citizenship, in which, of course, new technologies as well as women and men's bodies become part of what is being discussed and used and bargained in this kind of exchange between the citizen and the state. And of course, in this book I do separate between citizenship and nationalism, because at the same time that this kind of thing is happening under neoliberal discourse, demographic crisis and global policies of control of reproduction and so on very much continue, and religious discourses about abortion, about you know, the gag rule, which have affected so you know, profoundly the work of feminism globally, although it was redressed by Obama, but only, I think, very partially. So all these issues, of course, continue to evolve and interrelate in many ways.
Okay, well, there's reproduction, done and dusted. Okay, I think we will actually take our coffee break now. So please, if you can just take your ticket, go downstairs, but then return quite quickly if you can. We will start again at 11:15. Well, that was a wonderful start. We could just say that was the day. That's really great. No, I mean